Okay, good morning all. Again, I apologise that we had a slight issue with the live stream link, but I'm assured that that's all being fixed, so we'll get going. Thank you for attending this milestone event, the launch of Holding On to Our Future, the final report of the independent inquiry into the removal and placement of Aboriginal children in South Australia. The inquiry has taken close to 2 years to complete and is underpinned by the strong voice of the Aboriginal community. I note that today's event is being live streamed, and I want to acknowledge the people watching from across South Australia and nationally, many of which are the community members who participated in the 14 community forums held across South Australia, plus the 4 communities that were visited for private sessions. My name is Sean Oosting. I'm a one-year Garawa man, and I'm also a descendant of the stolen generation, and I'm your facilitator for today's event. I would like to acknowledge Commissioner April Lawrie, the South Australian Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, and I also acknowledge our VIPs for today's event, including the Honourable Katherine MP, Minister for Child Protection, Minister for Women and the Prevention of Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence, and Minister for Recreation, Sport and Racing. I would now like to invite Jakira Telfer to the stage to welcome us to country and share a greeting to Spirit of Place. Thank you, Jakira.
Namani, Nyanyari Jikirawario, Nyayaki Mina Yarta, Tawala Mina Yarta, Ngaiwangan, Malaria Mina, Wara, Ngai Chilinko, Marindi Komanka and Brandy, Tawala Mina Yarta, Ninko Nyai, Yarta, Tawala Mananja. What I just said, speaking in the mother tongue of this country as a daughter of this streaming, is I come from the Dry Forest clan, the Ghana people of the Adelaide region. And I greet you to the spirit of this place just behind me, Tandapari, the Kangaroo River. A very important, significant and sacred place, as all of our places across country are. It's very important to remember that. What I also said in language is acknowledging the 4 directions that you've all come from to be here today, but I want to extend that to my First Nations brothers and sisters in the room, and those who are watching, and the lands and waters in which you protect, speak for and come from, but also the 3 countries from the same thing, sky country, land country and sea country. I stand here and very honoured to be invited to greet you to the spirit of this place, but I think it's very important that I stand here as a young person, a young woman, thinking of the 7 generations before me, but also the 7 generations ahead. And I'd just like to thank all of you in the room for the work that you do for the community. As we know, our people come from circles, and it's very important now more than ever to keep those circles together and keep them strong. As you can see on the design there and the paint up that I'm wearing today. But I'm just going to share this breath of ochre as I cruise in the circle as a breath of country, but a memory of country that will always be here. Ma en nakara.
Thank you, Jakira, for your warm welcome to country, and I acknowledge that we are on Kaurna country. I acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of this country that we are gathering on today. I acknowledge the ever-enduring spiritual connection and relationship that Kaurna have with this country, and I pay my respects to Kaurna elders past and present. I also acknowledge the cultural authority of First Nations people from other nation groups who are attending here today. Now, just some housekeeping items. For those of us in the room, if I could please ask you to turn your mobile phones to silent. Restrooms are located directly out the door and down the corridor. If there is an emergency during today's event, we will be advised by the Convention Centre staff accordingly. Now, the purpose of today is about imparting the important messages and information from the Holding Onto Our Future report. Please note that we will not be taking any questions today due to this being a launch event. And you're invited to stay after proceedings for tea, coffee and a light snack, and where you can also continue this important conversation. I also want to emphasise that we are committed to the safety and respect of all attendees here today. We acknowledge that past experiences and traumas exist for the Aboriginal community, including problematic experiences in institutions and children who have experienced sexual abuse in care. And I want to reinforce that there is help in the community and that counselling support is actually available here today from Ngunnawal. So we have Shelley Ward, Trent Turner and Izzy McAvoy, who are the narrative therapist from Panthi, Social and Emotional Wellbeing Team at Ngunnawal. And they're on hand for today's event, so please let the event staff know if you would like to access the narrative therapist. Thank you. Now, as you may be aware, we've got a list of important speakers and guests today. So we'll have speeches from including Katherine Liddle, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Secretariat of the National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare, which is the national voice for our children. And SNAICC are the important champion of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principle on a national scale, working tirelessly to turn the tide of out-of-home care rates nationally. Also I'd like to welcome Christine Brown, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the South Australian Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation Network, SAACCON. And Christine's going to talk about the importance of putting children and families in front of Aboriginal community controlled organisations at a local level, providing community-led supports and changing outcomes for our children and families. And then we'll have Sandy Miller, who's a representative of the Interim Board of, and I'm going to have a go at this, Sandy, Wakwakurna Kanyini, otherwise known as the South Australian Aboriginal Child and Family Peak Body. So Wakwakurna Kanyini means holding on to our children in Ghana, Pitjantjatjara and Cookatha, and has the mission to be the leading community voice for Aboriginal children in South Australia, guiding the Cultural Authority, upholding their rights to grow up strong with purpose and identity in their families and connected to their community, culture, spirituality and country. And of course, we're going to hear from Commissioner April Lawrie, which I'll introduce now. So April is going to be our first speaker. So April, of course, is the South Australian Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. April is a Mirning and Cookatha woman dedicated to creating generational change for all women. For more than 30 years, April has led systemic reform in Aboriginal health, justice, education and child protection. As an inaugural Commissioner of Aboriginal Children and Young People, April leads the work that promotes the rights, development and well-being of Aboriginal children and young people within South Australia. April is also the co-founder of the Jindu Foundation, a not-for-profit organisation that works to promote well-being, cultural resilience and school retention for Aboriginal young people in communities across South Australia. As a director of the award-winning Far West Coast Aboriginal Corporation for 2 decades, April ensures local native title rights support generations to come by helping establish business ventures to enable self-determination and economic development for the Far West Coast people. April is also a passionate advocate for government service reform in child protection and for land rights and within native title. So before I ask April to come up and deliver talk about the holding onto our future report, we're going to play a short clip from the 1975 documentary filmed by director Janet Isaac, Sister, If You Only Knew. Now, Janet Isaac is one of Australia's earliest female First Nations directors and helped pave the way for the First Nations film in Australia. And I just want to point out that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this film clip may contain images, voices and names of deceased persons who may cause distress for some viewers. So we can have the video.
If they didn't like the way we looked after our children, they just came and took them away from us.
Nothing here at all, any value at all, as far as food goes.
expected, I suppose.
Nothing there either. Oh, this is no place for children. There they are.
The kid's right.
If they didn't like the way we looked after our children, they just came and took them away from us. They came and told us they were putting them into good white homes and institutions.
Take a deep breath. Judging from that clip, we see not much has changed. The stolen generations was never meant to happen again. That intergenerational pain, that sadness, that trauma, the grief and loss. The lasting harms of children being taken away en masse from family, from community and culture. Our nation, and indeed this state, was supposed to have learnt the lessons. And here we are, 50 years later, and it's continuing. Generations of children being subject to removals where the state foresee their future, often before they are even born. This is the final report of the inquiry into the application of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Placement Principle in the removal and placement of Aboriginal children and young people in South Australia, giving regard to reunification and prevention. The findings reveal that the state is unnecessarily removing disproportionate and growing numbers of Aboriginal children from their families and communities, causing long-term harm to their health, well-being and life chances, when they could be responding in a more child family-centred and culturally responsive way. And no matter where you look at the system, at every interface and every intersection, Aboriginal people are absent in the decision making. The Bringing Them Home report, published in 1997, and the National Apology in 2008 should have changed the way governments respond to the needs of our families and our children. But this is not the case for our Aboriginal community in South Australia. Today, the numbers of children being unnecessarily removed by the state are at levels comparable to the stolen generations. We cannot get away from that fact. The rights of our Aboriginal children to grow up safe with their family and their cultural identity are being trampled by the actions of the state. We saw that time and again through the evidence of the inquiry. Out of the stolen generations, our Aboriginal community leaders, they were steadfast. And one of those leaders is in the room with us today. I'd like to acknowledge Sandy Miller for all her early work in this space. But our leaders, they were steadfast in developing solutions to protect the rights of Aboriginal children to remain immersed and connected to their families, their communities and culture. So the Aboriginal Child Placement Principle was developed with these rights at the fore to counter the impact of that shocking time in our history. Our Aboriginal leaders knew and understood this rights-based principle as the way to steer policy, to steer decisions and to steer actions, with Aboriginal people at the forefront to keep our Aboriginal children safe with their family and growing up in community and culture. Today, it is different. In the state, it has been reversed. Our Aboriginal children are subject to child protection orders 11 times more than non-Aboriginal children. And we keep on saying that those rates are comparable to the stolen generations. It's no wonder when we see 1 in 2 Aboriginal children in South Australia, which here means half of all Aboriginal children under the age of 18 are being reported to child protection. Fathom that. We have approximately 16,000 or more Aboriginal children. That's 8,000 Aboriginal children being reported, resulting 1 in 10 Aboriginal children being in state care. Astonishing. Our Aboriginal children make up 5% of all children in South Australia, but are 37% of all children in out-of-home care. Over the past decade alone, there has been a staggering 116% increase of our Aboriginal children in care. A third of all babies statutorily removed from within birthing hospitals in 22-23 were Aboriginal babies. This practice is reprehensible. The irony is that this week I've been providing advocacy for a mother who had her baby removed. South Australia has the second highest, and we are a small jurisdiction, we have the second highest rate of Aboriginal children on long-term guardianship and the lowest rate of reunification at 3.8% in this nation. This is deplorable because our reunification rates, as small as they are, they keep going backwards. Of those in care, only 38% are being cared for by their Aboriginal kin or a member of the Aboriginal community. So the flip side of it is that we have over 60% of our Aboriginal children in non-Aboriginal care, away from their family, their community, and their culture. And if nothing changes, and I keep saying this over and over and again, by 2031, 140 in every 1,000 Aboriginal children in South Australia will be in state care. That's just 7 years away. This is unacceptable. This is an indictment on the rights of our Aboriginal children. We cannot let this happen. We cannot let this continue. The system is failing our children 50 years on, year in and year out. And if an Aboriginal organisation were producing these outcomes, you can guarantee all contracts would cease in one funding cycle with the same old story you weren't achieving. Nearly 2 years ago, I commenced this inquiry into how the principle is being applied in removal and placement of Aboriginal children. And no matter where I went, Aboriginal child removals were repeatedly raised with me as a significant issue by the Aboriginal community. People's lingering sense of harm, loss and grief could not be ignored. It was already clear that Aboriginal children were overrepresented in child protection. And what the inquiry found was even more alarming, that Aboriginal children were being unnecessarily removed from parents because of problems that are completely preventable. Problems stemming from poverty and intergenerational trauma, problems that have been allowed to escalate to a point where removals are the first resort and not the last. The inquiry found that decision-making has been taken out of the hands of the Aboriginal community and that the Aboriginal child placement principle has been diluted by the state within legislation, within policy and within practice. Unsurprisingly to the Aboriginal community, the inquiry found institutional and systemic racism and cultural bias in child removal and placement decisions. The final report of the inquiry represents the voices of Aboriginal people, especially our children and our families. It is grounded in evidence about where the change needs to happen and how it needs to happen. We have listened, and now we have a roadmap to correct the course. This inquiry has delivered 48 findings and 32 recommendations to bring about change. Of the 32 recommendations, 17 were from the preliminary report tabled in Parliament last year in October. These 17 recommendations were to inform proposed amendments to the Child Safety Act. Throughout the inquiry and to now, I've not seen the draft bill to make my own mind up as to whether those amendments hold true to the preliminary report recommendations. But here are 5 pivotal changes that can have immediate impact to stem the tide of Aboriginal child removals. 1, like I said, make changes to the legislation for things such as reinstating the primacy of child's best interests and embed the full Aboriginal child placement principle as the paramount consideration for Aboriginal children when considering their safety, well-being and best interests. Reverse the onus of proof so the state has to prove to the standard of active efforts their case for removal. We therefore must add accountability and oversight for improving outcomes in this legislation. Administrative powers held by the state stomp on the rights of our children and our families. We must give the courts powers to make those orders regarding contact and reunification, not the state. As Aboriginal people, we are invested in our Aboriginal children like no other. So too, we must change how decisions are made and put Aboriginal people in decision making for Aboriginal children, especially centring Aboriginal families in decision making. This means making family group conferencing mandatory for every Aboriginal child coming into contact with the child protection system, and for family group conferencing to be independently facilitated to uphold the fidelity of the program in a culturally appropriate manner, and increase the number of registered local level Aboriginal organisations by having at least one registered in each community. 3, abolish the use of assessment tools proven to be culturally biased towards Aboriginal people. Reinstate Yaitja Tirmangoti, the high-functioning Aboriginal team to manage notifications concerning our Aboriginal children and families. Cultural bias, as highlighted in the inquiry, exists within child protection and significantly increases the likelihood of removal, and once removed, our Aboriginal children are less likely to be reunified. 4, intervention must be earlier by giving parents intensive and sustained support to prevent issues from escalating. This means more investment in early intervention and prevention by government, involve more of our Aboriginal community organisations to support families who require the need, and to prevent those unnecessary removals. 5, legally empower and resource the Aboriginal community to implement a distinct kinship care system for Aboriginal children and young people. Where Aboriginal children are removed or require care, they must be placed with family and kept connected to community and culture. This is their birthright. The failure to act upon the recommendation means the cycle will continue. Struggling and vulnerable families will continue to encounter the child protection system at increasing rates. We must do all we can to stop this from happening again. Government will pay the cost one way or another for removals that are absolutely preventable. For the Aboriginal community, we can no longer tolerate this cost to continue at the expense of our children and our future generations. The time is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lawrie, for launching and providing an important overview of the report. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, which is Katherine Liddle. So just a bit of a bio of Katherine. Katherine is an Aranda and Lawrie woman from Central Australia and has been the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare SNAICC's Chief Executive Officer since January 2021. Katherine joined SNAICC with a strong background in senior management roles with First Nations organisations. Prior to being appointed the CEO of SNAICC, she acquired more than 10 years of experience in leading multidisciplinary teams, managing workplace transformations and advocacy for policy reform. Having held executive positions at the ABC, NITV, SBS and the Northern Territory Education Department, she was most previously the Regional Director of Jarwin Indigenous Corporate Partnerships for the Central Australia regions. Now, as the CEO of SNAICC, she is focusing her leadership on ensuring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's rights are upheld to ensure their safety, development and well-being. A journalist by trade, Katherine's motivation has always been to drive change that leads to positive outcomes and options for First Nations people. Katherine is excited to be continuing to build the organisation's strong platform in representing the voice of the next generation, which of course is our children. So Katherine was unable to attend today, and she sends her apologies, but she has kindly provided a pre-recorded speech, which we are going to play now. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Katherine Liddle and I'm the CEO of SNAICC, the National Voice for Our Children. I'd like to start today with a few acknowledgements, and the first, of course, is to acknowledge all your mob gathering on the lands of those awesome Kaurna people in South Australia. I acknowledge all of you. I acknowledge the Kaurna mob's elders, past and present, and all your leaders. Also have to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting on the lands of the Wurundjeri. Wish I could be there with you. And lastly, I have to acknowledge the incredible piece of work holding on to our future from the Commissioner, April Lawrie. For the first time, we have the voices of Aboriginal children, families and communities at the forefront of discussions about child protection in South Australia. I can't stress enough the significance of having our voices preferenced. Aboriginal people have for more than 60,000 years been the experts in knowing how to look after our children, how to raise our families, how to have strong communities. We are the ones that are most invested in our children because they quite literally are our future, the future of the oldest living culture in the world. In the early years of SNAICC, we were stood up by many South Australian voices, in particular Brian Butler, and this is an awesome moment to acknowledge that work too. People like Uncle Brian saw a problem in the way decisions were being made about our children. They recognised that Aboriginal voices and families and communities were never heard, and yet fundamentally it was understood we knew how to look after our children, we knew how to protect culture, we knew how to form communities. It was a driving force, and it continues to be a driving force for many Aboriginal people across the country, not the least of which those of you mob who live in South Australia. It is quite a relief actually that after all this time those voices actually have forums like this in which they can be used. Under the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, it was identified that governments really didn't know what they were doing when it came to looking after our children and our families. And that was the crux of what we now know as the National Agreement. That National Agreement committed all governments, including the South Australian government, to working differently. It gave us the opportunity to put our voices into rooms at a scale that we've never been able to do so before. So after decades of advocacy, we're actually starting to see real change like reports like this will drive. It's about moving away from commitments and motherhood statements into real action that drives change for our families on the ground. It's about recognising that we genuinely are the best place to understand what we need. We genuinely are the best parents. It's the understanding of this that gave rise to what we now know as the Aboriginal Child Placement Principle decades ago. We understood at that point in time that connection to your community, connection to your culture, connection to your kin actually changed the way you were able to develop, changed your ability to walk out into the world and participate. We know from the Family Matters report though that Aboriginal community controlled organisations still aren't necessarily the lead when it comes to looking after our children, and certainly not when our children or our families have come into trouble. We know though that the evidence says where there are Aboriginal community controlled organisations involved, we get a better outcome for our kids. One of the things that we've been working on under the Closing the Gap agreement is ensuring that all states and territories have their own peak bodies, their own vehicles for those voices to be heard, those own vehicles to identify what are the priorities for your distinct communities. And it's one of the things we've really enjoyed working on over the past 6 months is with a lot of the mob from South Australia going, well, what does peak body look like for you? And again, being cognizant that the national agreement that developed that lever was fought for by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, many of them old now and some of them already past. So I'd like to commend the Commissioner again for this groundbreaking report. And you know, I'm pretty sure you all know she's a pretty fierce advocate, and she absolutely is out there all the time making sure that South Australian voices are heard, that there are forums and rooms in which they can influence. I'd also like to commend all of you that give people like myself, people like the Commissioner, the strength to walk into rooms and have conversations that we never thought we'd have to have before. And I'd also like to commend all of you for never giving up, and to remind you all, you are the best culture in the world.
Thank you, Katherine. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, which is Christine Brown. So Christine is a Warramungu and Kaitete woman, I hope I pronounced it right, Christine, from the Northern Territory, and a Balladarong descendant, and has called Adelaide home since 2003. Christine has extensive experience in government managing projects across health, aged care, disability, employment, as well as managed the Darwin Aboriginal and Islander Women's Shelter before completing her law degree at Flinders University and a Master of Business Administration at the University of Adelaide. Today, Christine serves as the CEO for the South Australian Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation Network, SAACCON. Please welcome Christine.
Thank you, Sean. I'd like to pay respects to the Kaurna people, and I also recognise the continued connection for our people to their country, culture and community. As Sean mentioned, my name is Christine Brown, CEO of SAACCON. SAACCON is a network of over 20 Aboriginal community-controlled organisations across South Australia, and our work has been critical to closing the gap in Aboriginal outcomes. I was invited to speak today by Commissioner Lawrie, and I'm very pleased to be here at such an important event. I stand before you to laud the release of the Holding On to Our Future report. Commissioner Lawrie, you said what needed to be said. And this report not only reflects the views of many Aboriginal families and individuals across the state, it is a mirror for government to examine the way we have approached the welfare of Aboriginal children in South Australia and how our children have ended up excessively in out-of-home care and under guardianship orders more than any other population of children. What is hard to fathom is, with the benefit of hindsight, this state continues to get worse each year, and if government does not change the way that we do business, we will continue this race to the bottom. It does not have to be this way. There is a way for this state to become leaders, and this is through the Closing the Gap and the Aboriginal community-controlled sector. The relevance and necessity for Aboriginal community-controlled organisations is pronounced more than ever. You can't close the gap without Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. Target 12 of the Closing the Gap agreement is about reducing the rate of over-representation of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care. This target, and as what is conveyed in the Holding On to Our Future, cannot be achieved without Aboriginal community-controlled services and adequate funding for family support services. Local level ACCOs should be considered the primary driver for better outcomes for Aboriginal children and families, and are crucial for preventing removals of Aboriginal children. Any investment must elevate the capacity for Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to be able to provide early support and move away from the state being the only responder. Our local level Aboriginal organisations are best placed to respond to and support the needs of Aboriginal children and families within our communities. They know the Aboriginal child, their families, the communities, better than government. They buffer our children and families from the power and consequences of a government approach, especially child protection, for we know that our Aboriginal community-controlled services do not yield the harm inflicted by statutory services. Aboriginal community-controlled organisations have strong partnerships with their community. They have the relationships, the trust with families, and the community because they are embedded in the community. They help to channel the Aboriginal voice, they support local level problem solving, and alongside the community, wrap around the child and the family. The peak body will support this work too. Aboriginal communities are a collective. We understand collaborative approaches better than any. Aboriginal community-controlled organisations were established to counter the government's failures, and they were established to bring about self-determination, self-management, autonomy, and authentic community leadership. We know there are a number of things today that are held within the control of the Department for Child Protection, but were historically developed by the Aboriginal community and in control of the Aboriginal community, and such duties and responsibilities were fulfilled by the Aboriginal community-controlled sector. They need to be repatriated back to the Aboriginal community-controlled sector. We are talking about access to cultural knowledge, genealogies, finding families, and maintaining cultural connections for Aboriginal children and young people, to name a few. These cultural assets are the rightful possession of the Aboriginal community, and the cultural functions have a rightful place and belong within the Aboriginal community. They have no place in government systems and departments. Holding on to our future speaks of the importance of the Aboriginal community-controlled sector in helping change the outcomes for the Aboriginal children. SAACCON is working through the Closing the Gap agreement to fortify the important reform committed to building the community-controlled sector by focusing on building the capacity of ACCOs, improving funding, and shifting power to communities. In conclusion, Commissioner Lawrie, and to the Aboriginal community, your efforts will not be in vain. The Aboriginal community-controlled sector is best placed to serve the interests of Aboriginal children and families in need. Our Aboriginal children belong to our communities, not the state. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine, for your speech, and great to see you again. And it's been great to work with you over the last few months, working with ACCOs, and we know the incredibly important role that they play in providing services to our community. So thank you for that. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Sandy Miller. Sandy is a proud Wirangu and Cookatha woman from the Ceduna area and has been a trailblazer breaking down barriers for Aboriginal women aspiring to leadership roles at a time when they were underrepresented. Sandy trained as a social worker and in the early 1980s worked for the Department of Community Welfare in Adelaide. She pushed to change government policies that were detrimental to Aboriginal children and encouraged Aboriginal people to become foster parents. She went on to play an important part in policy development and service design across key state government portfolios, including Aboriginal health, ageing and welfare. Sandy continues to be a strong voice for the community since leaving the public service. She's had leadership roles in Aboriginal health and legal rights groups and holds multiple board and executive appointments. She has represented her community in the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance and at the United Nations. And finally, Sandy was the 2023 SA Senior Australian of the Year and member of the Aboriginal Advisory Group established to guide the inquiry. Please welcome Sandy Miller to the stage.
Thank you very much. I want to acknowledge that I stand on Kaurna land, always was and always will be. Today I speak on the critical role of the Aboriginal community voice in the child protection and family support system, as important to prioritise solutions for turning the tide of our children being overrepresented in out-of-home care. I stand here today representing Wakwakurna Kanyini, the South Australian Aboriginal Child and Family Peak Body. Although this peak is long overdue, it has been established at a critical time in our state. Wakwakurna Kanyini will be the leading community voice for the Aboriginal children and families in South Australia, providing guidance and leadership to uphold the rights of our Aboriginal children to grow up strong, with purpose and identity, and in their families and connected to their communities, culture and with spirituality to country. Aboriginal child removal is a matter of grave concern that has plagued our communities for far too long. This issue is not just a statistic, it is a reflection of systemic failures and a blatant disregard for well-being of our most vulnerable. It is vital to acknowledge the deep and painful impact of historical colonialist policies that led to removal of children from their families, and the result of this historical practice is acknowledged in the Holding On to Our Future report. The stolen generation is the past in the past and in the present today. It is not for our future generations. It has led to a legacy of intergenerational trauma for many and unnecessary removal of many Aboriginal children. As the Uluru Statement from the Heart has emphasised, our children are alienated from their families at unrepresented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them, or our youth language in detention is obscure numbers. They should be our hope for our future. The disproportionate rates of Aboriginal child removal are not due to a lack of love and care for their families. It is a result of institutional and systemic racism perpetrated by the state since colonisation. We, the Aboriginal community, the Commissioner and many others have said countless times, the Child Protection and Family Support Service system has been built in such a way where the only option to respond to problems associated with disadvantage is to funnel all Aboriginal children and families into child protection, when what is required is support, not removal. This has to change. The cost for the state to be involved unnecessarily in our families is twofold. More than 80% of our child protection funding in South Australia is allocated to removing and keeping children in care, and in the growing trend of residential care. This is the highest expenditure on care services in the nation and the lowest investment in supporting families. It goes to the issue of removals beget removals. The cost on our Aboriginal children and families is greater. Aboriginal children, once removed, are less likely to be reunited than non-Aboriginal children, and this causes significant disconnection from families, communities and culture, perpetuating a cycle we have all seen before in the stolen generations. There are multiple generations of families within our community who have never had the opportunity to raise their Aboriginal children due to intergenerational child protection contacts and removals. The state needs to give power back to the Aboriginal community. It is no longer viable that decision-making for Aboriginal children and families continue to be in the control of government. We need to act on the lack of investment in early support that is desperately needed to shift system responses from removal to preventing the need for any statutory involvement with effective and supportive Aboriginal community-led service responses. Self-determination does not happen through state-based services and is not facilitated by governments. Aboriginal community control organisations enable self-determination through the delivery of culturally responsive and safe support services with genuine relationships and trust to improve outcomes in the best interest of Aboriginal children. It continues to be evident that the child protection system is unable to transform itself. It needs to be open to much better collaboration, partnerships and influence from outside its own system. These changes need to be led and guided by Aboriginal leaders, in particular with other agencies. The inquiry and this first report, Holding On to Our Future, has laid strong foundations for the peak body's work and advocacy ahead. The peak body will be an important community voice, doubling down with the Commissioner in keeping the South Australian Government accountable for the implementation of the recommendations. We need major structural reform to the system to shift the focus to support and to shift power and responsibility to Aboriginal families and communities, and the people who know and care for children. The Aboriginal community control sector has spoken of the important role they play in helping vulnerable Aboriginal families in need by providing culturally safe and responsive support services. We welcome the Commissioner's call to better resource and to legally empower the Aboriginal community-controlled organisation sector so that we lead the change that is needed for our Aboriginal children and young people. We also welcome the Commissioner's recommendations for additional oversight and accountability mechanisms of government, led by Aboriginal people, and hope this work becomes a key priority for the peak body. After the 2016 Child Protection System Royal Commission, Aboriginal people had hopes for transformation within the system, but the change that have followed have been detrimental to outcomes for Aboriginal children and young people. New child protection legislation commencing in 2017 did not strengthen the need for the application of the Aboriginal child placement principle, instead diminished it, and disseminating the number of registered Aboriginal organisations and destroying the Aboriginal community voice in child protection. The Aboriginal child placement principle was developed by Aboriginal people for Aboriginal children, and many of those people who worked on that document are in this room. The Aboriginal child placement principle has been included in the 2017 legislation as if it were separate to the notion of safety and well-being. This is not the case. Children's safety and well-being are at its core. It's no wonder the rates of entry into out-of-home care have increased year on year since this time. The state must be held accountable for what they produce, the policies, legislation, funding and workforce, and of course the outcomes. Racist policies and legislation are written and enacted where it does not recognise the self-determination of Aboriginal people, with policies made for us, without us. Not having Aboriginal people's voice heard, not having Aboriginal people in the decision-making process or leading the decision-making. In order to make changes, we need to change the way in which decisions are made from the micro level to the child and family level. Aboriginal people make better decisions for Aboriginal children. Thank you, Commissioner, and congratulations on the milestone of the release of Holding Onto Our Future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy, for your speech. I would now like to welcome Commissioner Lawrie back to the stage to make some closing remarks. But before you do that, Commissioner, I understand there's a short case study video on the role and importance of family group conferencing to enable families to work together to make decisions about the care of the child or young person and to help prevent child removals. So we could please play that video. Thank you.
I honestly do believe that my son wouldn't be in my care right now if I wasn't part of family group conferencing. So I'm 27 years old. I've had a bit of a rough journey. I've made a lot of bad life choices, a lot of mistakes. I've got 4 children. They're 8, 7, 5 and 1. 3 of them do not live with me. They're still in care. They were taken at a very young age, obviously due to the choices that I made, my living arrangements, my partner at the time, domestic violence. When I fell pregnant, obviously having 3 older children in care, I was pretty afraid. I wasn't sure where it was going to go, what was going to happen. My 5-year-old was taken at the hospital straight after birth, and that was probably my biggest fear, that would be the situation again. Department for Child Protection contacted me while I was pregnant. They said that there was a new program. They made me referrals to places like DASA, Relationships Australia. I had numerous support workers through the hospital, Indigenous support workers, and they all played their role to help me make the choices that I needed to make. Throughout it, I was pretty nervous. I guess a lot of people don't probably have much faith in the system, and obviously with what happened in my past with my other children, I didn't have much faith in it. So even though they said that everything was going to be all good, I was really unsure about that. I wasn't sure that the way they said things were going to go is the way things were going to go. During the family group conferencing, they asked me and my partner, who did we want to be there, who was our closest supports. And, I said my pop, my nana, my partner's nana, his sister, and they made it possible for everyone to get there. Then they started asking us questions, what do we want for our son in the future? How are we going to support his needs as he grows up? That plan had to be signed by everyone to make sure that everyone done their part. It was different going from having no support in the past to having lots of support, and I had to learn to use it. But now that I spent the last year using that support network. It makes parenting so much easier when you've got everyone else. They say it takes a village. I feel good about it. Sometimes it can be overwhelming, but I think it's built a strong relationship, not just for me with my partner's family or for my partner with my family, but it's brought both of our families together in a good way. All children should get to learn and grow around their family. So yeah, for my son, my youngest son who's in my care, to get to learn about his knowledge from his Indigenous background, to come straight from his direct elders and his father, and that I think is very important, rather than it coming from, if he was in care, it would just be stories. Family group conferencing should be mandatory. It should definitely be introduced earlier. It should be available to all families that need it in their situations. I think that the best outcome for a child is that they remain with their family, and if the department can support that as the #1 goal and the first choice, then 100% that should be it. Like myself, my partner, us as a family know that we're supported, as well as the department knows that we're supported, rather than them having to step in, that the family can step in and make choices together as a family, rather than the department or someone else making them choices. I hope that my future holds my older children and my youngest son being together, getting to know each other, siblings, sibling rivalries, sibling, fun. That's what I see in my future. Being a mum is something that I always wanted to do, and I just want to watch my children grow up in the best possible environment and have the best possible lives. That's my ultimate goal.
That is truth-telling. Removal of Aboriginal children from their families does not have positive outcomes. Family group conferencing prevented a removal. It gave this mother and her baby hope for a better future. I want to thank everybody for attending and joining us online for the launch. I'm not sure whether Jakira is still with us, but I want to thank Jakira for a wonderful welcome to country and always telling us a story. Thank you. This is the final report of the inquiry into the application of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. This is the final report of the inquiry into the application of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle in the removal and placement of Aboriginal children and young people in South Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the hundreds of Aboriginal people who spoke with courage about their experiences of South Australia's child protection system. Their stories and experiences have been essential in informing the findings. I also acknowledge the hundreds of people working in the system who attended the forums, who gave insights to help understand the challenges faced in the system. The researchers, and some of them in the room, the witnesses, some are in the room. Your knowledge and your expertise in data, research, practice and leadership proved invaluable to the inquiry and shaping the report. To the South Australian Government, you should urgently implement the recommendations of this report. And we keep on saying this, whilst the stolen generations have left us with lasting scars, I hope this report, holding on to our future, its finding and recommendations will create a legacy of enduring positive change for Aboriginal children and young people today, tomorrow, and future generations. The beauty that we as Aboriginal people hold in our eyes of our Aboriginal children, of our family and our culture cannot be replicated by the state. The state does not know love, and the state cannot be a parent. For the family is the rightful possession of the Aboriginal child. Our Aboriginal families have been caring, loving and nurturing Aboriginal children and their cultural identities for millennia. And our Aboriginal children have a right to their culture. Culture strengthens our children. Culture is our past, is our present, is our future, not the stolen generations. The future of our Aboriginal children is to be in the hands of the Aboriginal community. We've had enough, it's time for action. The solutions have been put forward. It's time to listen to the Aboriginal voices. It's time to centre Aboriginal people in decision making. We know our children like no other. To government, work with me, work with the peak, work with the Aboriginal community controlled sector. We need the work of yourself, Jackie, as the Chief Executive. Many of the recommendations sit within your control. We need to bring about, Minister, a defined piece of legislation for Aboriginal kinship care and for resources for its implementation. Through our children, we are holding on to our future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Commissioner Lawrie, for your very insightful and deep closing remarks. Well, that does bring an end to today's formalities. On behalf of the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, April Lawrie, I would like to thank you all for your participation today on this event. For those attendees that are in the room today, please note that there are some hard copy reports available to collect. So as you walk out on the table to my left, there's hard copies, so please feel free to pick those up on the way out. For those of you who are streaming in today, and you prefer electronic documents, please visit the Commissioner's webpage, which is SAACCYP.com, where you'll be able to access the report. And as I mentioned before, for those of you who are attending in room today, you're invited to stay after proceedings for tea, coffee and some light refreshments. So thank you everyone and good afternoon.